Hello to everyone who's managed to join us today. My name is Andrew, and I'm one of the Cyber Essentials assessors at Precursor. And our plan today is to take you through the Cyber Essentials requirements, and more specifically, we'll cover some of the updates that have been introduced into the more recent versions under the name of Evandine. So, if you've not heard of us or worked with us at Precursor before, I'll just provide a little bit of a background on who we are and what we do. So we work with lots of different security consultants who have a broad range of skill sets and specializations. We focus mainly on security testing and adversary simulation, but we do work within compliance requirements as well, which is why we're talking about Cyber Essentials today. So just to run through our accreditations, we are a CREST accredited penetration testing provider. Our security testers have to meet a number of different examination standards to adhere to this. We're an approved certifying body under the ASME consortium, and we're also certified against the most recent Cyber Essentials Plus standard ourselves, and that's what allows us to be certified and qualified to conduct these Cyber Essentials assessments we're talking about today. We are also a trusted partner at the Northeast Business Resiliency Centre, and with this we often provide a range of different security consultancy and advice to businesses in the Northeast. And we're also certified to the ISO 27001 and 9001 compliance standards. So we ensure we maintain a number of internal security standards and best practices. As to what services we actually provide, so Cyber Essentials and Plus certification is what we're talking about today. On top of this, there are a number of other compliance requirements we work within. So we have done a number of PCI security testing. We've met ISO 27001 requirements, which includes some vulnerability testing as well. However, as I mentioned before, a lot of our specialization is within manual security testing or penetration testing. And for this, we can provide a broad range of experience in web application testing, infrastructure, security audits, cloud security reviews, such as AWS, Azure. We also work with a number of automation services, regular testing to make sure that your systems are staying secure and up to date. And off the back of this work that we do, specifically within cloud services, we've actually worked towards producing a automated tool, which is being called Cloud Integrity. And this can be used to conduct a complete security audit of your cloud environment, whether it's Azure or AWS. And its idea is that it'll highlight any issues for you, provide remediation advice, anything that might impact your system and your users. And the reason I bring this up, which will likely be important in a little bit, is that the new standards of Cyber Essentials actually require that cloud services are now included in your assessment scope. So if you've never conducted any security review of your cloud environment or never considered it before, this might be a perfect solution. Okay, so to briefly run through the agenda that we're covering today. So we can cover some of the major updates that have been introduced into the Cyber Essentials assessment this year. We can cover the scope definition for Cyber Essentials, so what devices are in scope, what's out of scope, whether you're looking to just assess the whole organization, just a subset, how that can work for you. We can look at some of the updated definitions from ASME, which describe how your user account should be managed, how your password requirements need to be managed. As mentioned, cloud services are now incorporated into Cyber Essentials, so we can cover all the requirements that these services need to meet and the management of these services. Bring your own devices have actually been included in the scope for a while for Cyber Essentials, but it can impact your scope definition and it has its own set of management requirements. So we'll just review these types of devices and how that works within the assessment. And if you're planning on running through Cyber Essentials Plus certification, we can look at the specific practical tests which make up this part of the assessment. Okay, so first off, just to make sure we're all on the same page, and if this is the first time you've ever looked into Cyber Essentials, I'll just give a bit of a brief outline of what it actually is. So Cyber Essentials was set up as a government-backed scheme, and it is now IASME who are partnered with the NCSC to manage the assessment as a whole. The scheme works in two stages. The first is you've got Cyber Essentials, which is it's considered a self-assessment questionnaire. It still requires an assessor to review and grade the questionnaire at the end in order to pass, but you fill it in yourself and submit yourself. The second part, or Cyber Essentials Plus, this is a practical assessment against the devices, the policies, the technical controls, anything that is outlined in the questionnaire. The overall aim of this part of the assessment is just to ensure that what you've outlined in the questionnaire is actually what you're doing in practice. And the aim of Cyber Essentials as a whole is just to try and make sure that organizations meet a baseline level of security and that they're protected against some of the more common threats and attacks which businesses face today. So for the standards that need to be met, they break down into the Cyber Essentials 5 key control areas. So for this, you have firewalls, secure configuration, user access controls, malware protection, and security update management. And the intention of each control is that you have policies and that you have technical measures in place to make sure that all of your devices are configured to this baseline security standard. They're all kept up to date, they're protected against the latest potential security threats, and that they've also got a level of protection from malware attacks, so there's some level of malware protection in place. In addition to this, you'll also be looking to ensure that all of your user accounts are secured, that your users are educated correctly on the importance of security and good password choices, hopefully. You can also have a series of checks and processes in place to make sure that how you intend your devices to be configured and secured is actually reviewed and it's actually how it's being implemented in practice. Okay, so possibly an important thing to consider for you is why? Why bother getting Cyber Essentials? Why become certified at all? Especially if you've never become certified before and it's all new to you. Effectively, what's the point of this? So, in addition to making sure that your organization does meet this baseline level of security and reducing your overall likelihood of compromise from a range of different exploits, certification is actually a requirement if you're bidding on a number of government contracts now. We've also noticed it become more of a supplier requirement in recent years within the private sector. So ideally, it can help you win more work. And as you receive a certification number, which is searchable within a public database, and you can actually use the Cyber Essential branding, it actually works to promote your organization and it advertises that you've just taken a considered approach to your security, that you've acted upon it, that you've taken steps to make sure that your systems and your clients' data is going to be secure. Okay, so for reference, some of the Cyber Essentials information I'll be covering today is actually from online published documents, and we can provide links to these for anyone who would like access to them. The material can actually help bring a bit of insight into the assessment requirements, especially if it's your first time and you've never really touched on Cyber Essentials before. The other thing is this material might just highlight some areas of your business which currently don't meet the required standards for Cyber Essentials, or it could just point out some areas that need a bit of improvement in general. Alright, so for the actual updates to the Cyber Essentials standard, first of all, we have a number of updates to the questionnaire. So for this, there'll be some further information, some more specific detail is requested in addition to previous year's questionnaires. And any cloud service you use has to meet the 5 key control areas of Cyber Essentials, just the same way any of your other devices or assets meet those key control areas. And then in Cyber Essentials Plus, the vulnerability tests that are done, the practical testing, the vulnerability scanning, that's actually undergone some specific updates as well, and how the device is assessed, how the vulnerabilities are graded, those things have changed, and they could impact your certification if you're going through Cyber Essentials Plus this year as well as last. Now, I've got some slides on each of these points. I'm going to go into some specific details on the updated areas. But first of all, we'll just run through what the scope requirements are, just so that we all know how to define your scope and what's going to be in and out of scope for Cyber Essentials. So for the scope of the assessment, a lot of the devices that were covered in previous years are still covered. So firewalls, servers, workstations, mobiles, even BYOD devices, bring your own devices, that's all part of the scope. And if you've never run through Cyber Essentials before and you've never conducted any security testing of your devices, one of the things you might actually want to consider is kind of like an initial security review or an initial audit of these devices that might make up your scope. This might just act as a bit of an eye-opener. It might provide a bit of insight into what issues and what problems that you might encounter, things that just need to be addressed before you actually get to the point where you're in a position to become Cyber Essentials certified. And if that's something you wanted to discuss or if you wanted to go through, we can actually work with you on that through variations of security testing, vulnerability scanning, all that kind of things. So we'll just get you in a position where you're ready to be certified. Now, in addition to some of the major updates, there's also a couple of minor changes to the scope definitions of Cyber Essentials. So, for users who are classed as home workers, essentially, if someone is allowed to work from home, either part-time or full-time, they'll likely be considered as a home worker under Cyber Essentials. And their device and how they connect to the internet, they both need to be considered when you're defining your Cyber Essentials scope. There is actually no longer a requirement to manage home routers. So that was a big issue that a lot of people had before, trying to manage routers that are issued by BT, Sky, just any internet service provider. So that no longer forms part of the scope. So unless you're specifically providing a router or a firewall to the user's home that you manage directly, the home router itself shouldn't really form part of the scope. Instead, what you should be looking at managing is the software firewalls that are installed on the devices that a home worker is using. You should be looking at VPN services and allowing them to connect back into your network and your offices. And you can continue to manage the device through a network firewall. So as you can see from the image and the scope definition, it does kind of incorporate most devices within an organization. However, there are a couple of caveats to this. So things like wireless access points that don't directly connect to the internet, they don't typically need to be considered in scope. The same applies to switches. If they don't directly connect to the internet, don't need to be considered in scope. In terms of how you define your scope for servers, it is possible to take some of these devices out of scope. But it is provided that they don't connect directly to the internet and that a user on them can't initiate an outbound connection to the internet. So having servers like this, which are out of scope, can actually be useful sometimes, particularly if you have any legacy systems which still need to be used for your business, but you're not in a position to update them. Because regular updates are a requirement under Cyber Essentials, if you have any servers where you just can't update them, trying to eliminate them from the scope by making sure they're not connected to the internet is a way of doing this and still becoming certified at the end of it. So this overview that I'm showing you here, this is intended to reflect how an entire organization would be defined in the scope of Cyber Essentials. But if you don't want this, you do have an option just to define a section or a subset of your organization as the scope. And the way you do this, the important thing to consider is the two areas of your business, so the in-scope and the out-of-scope areas, they need to be able to have some sort of segmentation, some sort of network segmentation between them, either through firewalls, VLANs, subnets. So it's not really possible to just have a big interconnected organization with everything communicating with everything else and then just pick and choose what is in scope and what is out of scope out of that big group. So if you're going with a scope definition which is a subset, just make sure that you have this clearly defined boundary, you have this clearly defined segmentation, that the data and systems that you have just have strict controls around them, and that you have this limited user base of people accessing these systems. Okay, so once you've got your scope defined, your devices, your users, the next thing you're going to want to have in place is something towards your account management, your password policies, your lockout policies, making sure that your users are sufficiently educated and supported towards making good password choices. So there are a few things that can be put in place to make sure that you're in line with these points, that you're facilitating this. The specifics are outlined in the requirements for IT infrastructure document, which we can provide to you. Essentially, there needs to be something in place to ensure that either NFA is in place or a suitable secure password. And this helps protect your accounts from brute force attacks, especially if you have any login services that just directly face the internet that are likely to be hit by that type of attack. And so secure passwords and just some ability to restrict login attempts or lock out accounts, it's just a good defensive measure to address this potential issue of brute force password attacks. Now for the user education, you should ideally have a password policy document, regular training, regular educational information that's distributed to your staff. This information can actually help them just make an informed choice and informed decision about picking strong passwords. Or you could actually just encourage the use of password managers. So one of the things that is mentioned in the Cyber Essentials questionnaire and isn't really encouraged anymore is to set up regular password expiry. Because what this typically leads to is users just picking predictable and also incremental passwords, which is why it's quite common to see passwords based on days of the week, months of the year, or just slight incrementations when passwords are reset each month. So password 1, password 2, password 3. And the reason that happens is because these often fall in line with just standard complexity rules, and they're just easy to remember. So if you have to continually change your password every month, it's just a simple solution for users. So moving away from these traditional complexity rules and towards password management through user education and training, that kind of thing, that's the route that IASMIN and Cyber Essentials are trying to take you down. And so if you've never conducted a review of your user account, you've never really considered the security of your account credentials, that kind of thing, there's a couple of options for what you could actually consider doing. First up is you could have an internal network security assessment, you could have an internal Active Directory security assessment, and within that you could have a security audit of your user base and the authentication system itself. This could potentially help provide a bit of insight into some of the existing weaknesses that could be taken advantage of, some of the existing weak accounts that could be easily compromised, and it could provide a bit of insight into patterns for bad password choices, a bit of help and advice on improvements that can be made to make the whole thing more secure. Okay, so moving on, we have cloud services. So as I mentioned before, cloud services are now in scope, and the Cyber Essentials key controls apply to each of these services. So this includes each different type of cloud service. So you have platform as a service, software as a service, infrastructure as a service. All have different levels of management requirements. Some will be managed by you, some will be managed by the cloud provider, but each of the key controls need to be met regardless of who is actually responsible for that management. For the most part, with the things that will directly fall under your control, this will likely revolve around the user accounts that you create and issue, making sure that each of these user accounts adhere to the same rules as any other account, and that you're making sure that your accounts are secure, your credentials are secure. Importantly with cloud service accounts is that making sure that because it faces the internet, multi-factor authentication is enabled for the login. So currently under this requirement, MFA needs to be turned on for your admin accounts, but it is just your admin accounts as of right now. As of January next year in 2023, all users of your cloud services will just need to have this multi-factor authentication turned on and enabled. So even if you use a cloud service which just doesn't provide MFA as an option, unfortunately that's just not really acceptable under the Cyber Essentials scheme. So the only real solution at the moment is to put continual pressure on the providers of these services to try and get them to enable MFA. Barring that, the only real option is actually just to migrate to a different provider who will offer MFA as an option. So in addition to making sure that your user accounts are secure, that your MFA solutions are in place wherever needed, one of the things you do need to make sure is in line with the Cyber Essentials requirements is the secure configuration key control. So in line with this, you just need to make sure that your cloud environments, your services are configured to a secure standard as kind of outlined in the questions in the Cyber Essentials questionnaire. And one of the things you should probably think about is if you've never had any security assessment conducted or any security review conducted against your existing cloud services, it might be a good idea just to look into that cloud integrity solution I mentioned before, and you can just get an overview of how everything's configured, does it meet certain security benchmarks, and just try and highlight and address any potential issues before you start going through the compliance and assessment process. Okay, so if we move on to another issue that trips up a lot of people, which is bring your own devices, BYODs. So one of the most common issues we come across often is that when defining a scope or just managing the devices in general, it's what to do with personal devices with BYODs, which have been allowed access to company resources. This could be just connecting to the network in general, it could be accessing different services, it could even just be accessing email, Teams, different messaging applications, that kind of thing. So the simplest answer I can offer for this problem is just to don't allow these devices, don't have any unmanaged personal devices accessing your company resources. Have a company issued device which is under your direct management and control from the very start, and just don't have personal devices accessing systems just for any reason. So although that sounds simple and straightforward on the face of it, I totally appreciate it doesn't always work like that, and there can, for a number of reasons, be a mixture of company issued and personal devices which have access to your network, have access to your data, and unfortunately this means that they're included in the scope of Cyber Essentials. And this actually just introduces its own set of problems. So for mobiles, laptops, desktops, how are these devices going to meet the standards? How are they going to meet the requirements if you don't have direct management? And for this, there will just need to be some level of agreement, some level of, likely some level of administrative control that's applied to these devices, just to make sure that they're logged when accessing your systems, that to at least certain requirements they can adhere to the company standards. For the user accounts that are logging into those machines, you'll likely want to make sure that there's a separation between your standard day-to-day user account and your admin account. Those kind of requirements will need to apply to make sure that the devices are Cyber Essentials certified. And then also, if you're going through Cyber Essentials Plus, all of the practical testing that we'll go through later, this will actually need to be done for all of these devices as well. And in order to pass the assessment, all of these devices, company and bring your own devices, they'll need to meet all of the requirements. So it may be the case that some decisions just need to be made about which devices are going to be allowed to access your business, which devices are going to be allowed to access company resources, or you're going to have to try and agree to a set of restrictions that can be put in place on all devices, and that includes the personal devices. So obviously this can be an issue and it can be a struggle. It is definitely possible. We've taken multiple companies through Cyber Essentials with personal devices before. But yeah, there definitely needs to be an agreement with the users of those devices of how they're going to be managed and making sure they're in line with the requirements and in line with the standards. So some ways that you can try and account for this big mixture of devices is to try and have a central management platform where you can keep an eye on and log all of the devices that are connecting in, and in order to connect in, they have to meet a certain set of security requirements just before they get access to anything. So that could be a platform like 365 and Intune, which will just help to keep check on all the devices that are accessing the system. There's also other solutions that you could look into, like Azure AD, getting a license and getting a configuration set up like that. Again, so that lots of different devices that are managed remotely, including personal devices, they'll have to have policies pushed out for them. They'll have to agree to those being applied to the device in order to access systems in the first place. Alright, so if we continue on with the specific requirements for Cyber Essentials Plus now, and the practical tests which we have to run through in order to get you certified for this. So if you've never gone through Cyber Essentials Plus before, there are a few tests which are essentially the same. There's some which have got a few minor updates to them now, but there's also a couple of new checks that weren't in the previous year which will have to be done. So you can see from the list here each of the test types that need to be completed and passed as part of the Plus assessment. So I'll just work through each of these one by one so you get a bit of an understanding and a bit of an overview of what each test is, what's involved, and if you needed any further information or reference to these tests later on, we can link you to the test specification document which outlines these requirements as well. So first up with Cyber Essentials Plus assessments, there'll be an external vulnerability scan which is required to be conducted. This is typically done against any external facing IP addresses and services you have which might face the internet. What we're looking for here are any high-risk critical security issues that might show up in a vulnerability scanner. Because in the questionnaire there is a specific requirement to make sure that patches are applied within a 14-day period from patch release. So we need to just make sure that your systems are adhering to that and that they're kept up to date. The process actually does also include a review and assessment against your login services, so anything that you have facing the internet which a user could potentially log into. And for these, we'll be looking to make sure that the user restrictions, the lockout restrictions that we mentioned earlier are all in place as well. So if you've never run through Cyber Essentials or any security testing before, particularly of your external network, there's a couple of options you could look into before you get to the point where you're doing the practical test for Cyber Essentials Plus. One is you could look at a manual security review against anything you have that faces the internet. And then the other is to look at some automated scanning solutions, particularly something that you could have that runs every month or every quarter on a schedule that works for you, just to make sure that you can stay on top of any potential vulnerabilities, and particularly that you're meeting those patching requirements that Cyber Essentials outlines. Okay, so if we stay on vulnerability scanning requirements for now, your end user devices also have to receive vulnerability scans under Cyber Essentials. So this could be your laptops, desktops, could be a virtual machine, effectively wherever you're providing a standard user with an interactive desktop and they can access the internet, open emails, that kind of thing. This will be part of the vulnerability scan requirements for Cyber Essentials. So if you have quite a few of these devices, well, depending on the number of them, we'll likely only need to test a sample or a subset of them rather than everything. If you've only got a few devices and you're a smaller organization, it's quite possible, it's quite likely that we'll end up needing to test all of your devices. The idea is it works on a percentage assessment of your organization, and so we just need to make sure we're covering those percentage requirements. So for the vulnerability scans of workstations, these actually need to be run with administrator permissions, and the idea is to make sure that your operating system, all the installed software, it's all kept up to date. Similar with the external, we're looking for high risk and critical security updates, things that haven't been applied within 14 days to make sure that you're in line with what the questionnaire requirements outline. So hopefully you are relatively on top of patching and you have a lot of automated updates in place. Typically, in my experience, there is something that needs to be installed, something that needs to be applied, which for whatever reason just didn't receive that update, didn't receive that patch. So there's something you can do towards this. Again, if you've never gone through Cyber Essentials before, you've never done any security testing of your workstations or any of your devices, one of the things you can actually look at is, same as the external, you can look at manual testing or you could look at automated testing, both of which we could be in a position to help you out with. And you can just try and make sure that all of your devices, all of your networks, looking in a secure state that looks to be compliant before you actually get to the point where you're doing Cyber Essentials. Alright, so sticking with your workstations for now, because there's actually quite a few checks that need to be run through on these. So first off, there's like a file access check, and this is intended to be run as a standard user of the device. And the test breaks down into a couple of different types of test file. You have executable file types, and then you have these AV type files. And for the first test, the executable types, the intention is that you have this range of different file types and file extensions which effectively represent a random set of files that a user could potentially download and get from the internet. And these could be delivered either as an email attachment or it could be downloaded through a web browser. And the purpose of the test is to identify that somewhere between downloading these files and trying to run the file, there should ideally be some form of restriction, some form of security warning, something that acts as like a middle step, just to make sure that these random internet files, they don't just run by default, they don't just execute immediately when you try and download them. And then for the second type of file, these AV type files, the antivirus files, The intention with these types is that you just shouldn't be able to get access to them in the first place. Some form of security system or malware protection solution should kick into gear and basically block you from just having them on your machine in the first place. Okay, so still sticking with your workstations, there's a section within the questionnaire which describes how you protect your devices for malware protection. And there's three solutions which are outlined in the questionnaire, and whichever solution you have in place, it just needs to be checked and verified that it's working as intended. So the first option outlined in the questionnaire is that you could solve this by having antivirus software installed. And that should just identify malicious files, it should ideally prevent them from running. And the purposes of this part of the assessment is just making sure that that solution is in place, that it's up to date, that it's identifying and detecting potentially malicious files as it's intended to. And then the second option detailed on the questionnaire is you could actually set up a certificate-based application allow list. And then the idea with this is that anything that's not on that list, you shouldn't be able to run or shouldn't be able to execute. And so that is how you'd protect your system from potentially malicious files from executing. So the second option on the questionnaire for malware protection is that you can manage this through a certificate-based application allow list. And the idea would be that anything on the list can run and anything not on the list can't run. And that's how you can protect potentially malicious files from executing because they're not going to be on the list. And the way we manage this, the way we'd assess this as part of the practical testing is just to try and run something that doesn't appear on this list. So the idea would be that we try and run something and then it just won't execute because it's not on your approved allow list. And then the final option on the questionnaire is you could actually set up an application sandbox, and then anything that runs within that sandbox should have no impact on anything outside of it. So the assessment for this would just be to verify, is this sandbox in place? Is it set up so that users can run executable files in it? And then is it segmented? Is it run in isolation so it doesn't impact any of your other systems? Okay, so still sticking with tests for your workstations. This is actually one of the new additions to the practical tests. So the questionnaire goes into a bit of detail about how you manage your user accounts, how you manage your standard user accounts, and also your admin user accounts. And we talked a little bit about this account separation and management of accounts earlier, how that your standard user account should be separate from your admin user accounts. Ideally, most of your users will just have standard user permissions anyway, and they won't actually have access to an admin account in the first place. And the assessment requirement here is just looking to confirm that this account separation is in place, that your standard users aren't admin users, and that your standard users can't just execute admin actions without any kind of additional authentication action or authentication prompt. Alright, so for mobile devices, if you do have mobile devices that are defined in your scope, these will need to be assessed as well. So the tests for these aren't quite as extensive as what you'd find for a laptop or desktop, but the intention is that you need to verify what's on the questionnaire is done in practice. So you're mainly looking to confirm, are devices up to date, making sure they're not missing any security patches. Do your password policies, do your lockout policies, do they also apply? Are they configured to the standards that you've set out in the questionnaire? One of the key things for mobile devices is that they also need to be protected by some form of malware protection. So I've gone through these requirements for mobiles a few different times, and usually the only solution that tends to work out is setting up an approved application list or a documented list of approved applications that can be run and installed on mobile phones. Okay, so one of the other more recent updates to the practical testing for Cyber Essentials Plus is this incorporation of the cloud services that you might have defined in your scope. And in addition to the user requirements, the configuration requirements outlined and defined in the questionnaire, what we're looking to confirm specifically for Cyber Essentials Plus is that your multi-factor authentication settings are in place for your user accounts. And as I was mentioning earlier, if you never looked into the security of your cloud services, or this is the first time you're going through Cyber Essentials, it might be worth looking into a security audit of your cloud environment just to make sure that it lines up with all the Cyber Essentials requirements, that there's no critical security issues that might be affecting it. And an automated review such as cloud integrity would be just a perfect solution to sort of account for all these possible issues. Okay, so that actually covers all of the assessment requirements, and if you're able to meet all these standards, you'll receive your certification for Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus. Now, I do realise that all of these requirements put together can be a lot to take on board, particularly if you've just never run through security testing or Cyber Essentials before. But it is often the case that there are just some straightforward solutions to each of these requirements, and we've actually worked with around about 100 organisations on Cyber Essentials now, and so far we've always managed to find some solution that can work for them and that brings them in line with the Cyber Essentials requirements. So I'm sure there is a solution for you. Okay, I think we're going to wrap things up there. I had planned on taking a few questions, but I think we're definitely pushing that 30-minute time window we were aiming for. For the questions that were asked, I'll make sure we get back to each of you. Other than that, thank you all very much for attending. I hope this information was useful to you, and hopefully will help you achieve Cyber Essentials. If you do have any other questions that come up, or any other security requirements at all, please get in touch. We'll be happy to help out. Okay, goodbye.